and you are watching a live edition of Dialogue coming to you from CCTV News here in Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. 2012 was a significant year for China and many other countries around the world, with a couple of dozen national elections going on. Wrapping up political campaigns and rhetoric, many are pinning their hopes on the year 2013 for getting some important work done. But what are the important priorities for China in the year 2013? What role will China play in the world in the new year? Chinese President Hu Jintao made his New Year's speech on the very last day of 2012. Let's take a look at some of the important highlights of it.
2012年是中国发展进程中具有重大而深远意义的一年。前不久召开的中国共产党第18次全国代表大会和18届一中全会，描绘了全面建成小康社会和深化改革开放的宏伟蓝图，顺利实现了中国共产党中央领导机构新老交替。当前，中国各族人民正紧密团结在以习近平同志为总书记的党中央周围，万众一心，锐意进取，为全面建成小康社会而奋斗。2013年，中国政府和人民将高举中国特色社会主义伟大旗帜，坚持以科学发展为主题，以转变经济发展方式为主线，继续把握好稳中求进的工作总基调，全面推进改革开放和社会主义现代化建设，为实现党的18大确定的目标任务开好局、起好步。我们将坚定不移贯彻一国两制、港人治港、澳人治澳、高度自治方针，深化交流合作，促进香港、澳门长期繁荣稳定。我们将继续推动两岸关系和平发展，造福两岸同胞，维护中华民族根本利益。当前，国际形势继续发生深刻复杂变化，和平、发展、合作、共赢是各国人民的共同愿望。各国相互依存，日益紧密。同时，国际金融危机影响深远，世界经济低速增长态势仍将延续，一些国家和地区动荡不安，世界仍然很不安宁。人类只有一个地球，各国共处一个世界。世界和平与发展需要各国人民同舟共济，共同推进。中国人民始终是促进世界和平与发展的坚定力量。无论国际风云如何变幻，中国人民走和平发展道路的坚定决心绝不会动摇。
Those are the highlights of the New Year's speech given by Chinese President Hu Jintao. To talk about these highlights, I'm joined in the studio by Mr. Wang Xuwen, who is the former Vice Chief Editor of the International Business Daily here in China. Welcome, sir. And we're also joined by Mr. Xiao Geng, who is the Director of Research with the Fang Global Institute. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. You've just heard a speech given by Chinese President Hu Jintao. One interesting point we should really touch on is the emphasis he made over and over again about China's international role. And on that, he used some specific words which might sound familiar, but you might want to explain to us under this context what exactly he meant. For example, he talked about China, as always, strengthening its ties and cooperation with other countries under the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. However, he also emphasized the importance of China to be involved even more into international affairs. Mr. Wang, would you like to help us to understand this balance?
And the 5 principles of peaceful existence was put forward by China and the other developing countries in the 1950s. And it has been ever since the guiding principle of China's diplomatic policies, and now still applies. But with the growth of China's strength in economy and with the growth of China's influence, China is required and China needs to play a more important role in international affairs. But a greater role in international affairs does not contradict the 5 principles. But as the world changes, maybe we should make some micro adjustment.
Micro adjustment, that's an interesting word to be used. Mr. Xiao, how should China reconcile its ever-increasing necessity and responsibility of playing a bigger role in the international affairs, whether it's economic issues or political issues, with some of the long-time held principles, such as the principle of peaceful coexistence, which was initiated at the time when China was quite isolated as a new country back in the 1950s?
Well, I think for China, it's very important that China should participate in the shaping of global rules, especially in some of the international organizations. So in that way, we can have more influence. But at the same time, just like families and companies respect the market rules, so we should, no one should interfere, any other families or any other companies. So within the company, within the family, you have your own issues to resolve by yourself. The same thing for the country. I think this is actually quite easy to understand if we trying to look at the real world.
Well, it is easy to understand, but at the same time, we also understand there are so many various kinds of hot issues popping up over the past year, and certainly going to be in the year 2013. For example, the issue of Syria, for example, the nuclear issue going on in the Korean Peninsula, which is likely to be escalated as a result of some of the recent developments there. And meanwhile, the political leadership changes in so many different sensitive, as some say, countries, and there might be eventually different actions and interactions among these countries. So what is the kind of balance that China should adhere to? Does non-interference means doing nothing?
Actually, China has been seeking to play a more important role in the framework of multilateral international relations. And just now, Mr. Jiao has mentioned China has been playing a more important role in making rules. And in the past years, China joined WTO. China become a member of the Security Bureau of the United Nations. Well, by the time the 5 principles were put forward, all that were non-existent. So China really played an important role. For instance, in the problem, in the issue of Syria, China has sent an envoy there, but China's purpose is trying to find opportunities to see how negotiations can be conducted between the Syrian government and the anti-government forces. China is not going to interfere in their relations, but China is going to find the opportunity to find platforms for them, for the Syrian people, to solve problems for themselves.
But there have been different opinions, of course, about how the Syrian crisis should be resolved. We can just use it as an interesting example to illustrate a very delicate balance that China needs to keep at this moment. Mr. Xiao, we understand that people have been saying China, with its long-held tradition and belief, for example, Confucianism, Taoism, both of which are only seeking for peace, only seeking for harmony, instead of into crisis through certain forces and therefore eventually resolve the crisis. So it's very two different kinds of thinking and philosophy. Some argue, though, Mr. Xiao, those that China has been holding for hundreds and if not thousands of years might not necessarily be the principles that is suitable to be practiced these days on crises such as the Syrian issue or many other issues. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the world is so integrated, and I think every countries are learning how to work together. And each country has their own problem, and there are also other problems. So I think for international issues, the best way is to use the multilateral approach. If you every country, if you want to do something, you have to think about whether you want to apply to your own country. You want other countries to apply the same practice to you before you actually trying to influence other countries. So I think this is the trend. I think this is more obvious in the economy. All the companies, all the countries are respecting the international rules. But in the international relations, I'm not an expert. I think this is going to be very similar because we have to live in the same world.
That's right. Let me just throw you an economic example. China has been, together with other emerging economies, very keen to play their roles inside international organizations, such as World Bank or the IMF. And certainly we've seen steps, for example, involving the IMF for the voting rights of emerging economies. But with the traditional player reluctant to give up some of the already percentage of voting rights, and even though sometimes agreeing to give up, but still not practicing it, China and other emerging economies are still having difficulties of having bigger say. So if only, let's say, Dr. Xiao, with the principle that China has been holding for hundreds of years, let's seek peace, let's seek harmony, are things likely to be resolved? Are Chinese and together with other emerging economies going to really find their rights be realized, not only on paper, but also in practice?
Well, I think one important issue is that China and other developing countries as well, they have to first develop the rule of law so people can predict what the Chinese companies, Chinese peoples will do in the future. Then I think the international community would accept the more participation by China. Because before you know the members, you are afraid of people, new members. You don't know how they behave, how they will vote, how they will act, right? So in that sense, I think China is in a critical period to show to the international community, China actually follow the rule of law. China respect the property rights. All those things, will help the international community to basically welcome China into the global stage.
Well, yes, indeed, China needs to do that. But many would also argue, well, hearing your words, Mr. Wang, is it a thing that is coming in order, that China has to mend its own fences first, perfectly, only after that it can go to the community and claim its rights, which should be given to itself by the international community, just fairly?
And it's a natural process, but in the process, China should make some initiative. And actually, with the growth of China's national strength, it's playing a more and more important role. And the other countries are also expecting China to play a greater role. For instance, just now we mentioned the IMF, the World Bank, and even the United Nations. Just recently, China increased its contribution to the UN. And with a percentage about 5%, over 5%, increase of more than 1 percentage point. That shows China's influence. And China's role will match its national strength. And in the same process, China takes the lead and helps the other emerging economies, emerging countries, also play a more important
I
role,
see.
make themselves better heard.
But here's the critical issue. We've been talking about economic issues, talking about China's diplomatic influence, and of course China at the same time its military is getting ever stronger with the needs of protecting its interests elsewhere in the world. But some argue, Mr. Xiao, that China might not be able to, just as any country might not be able to, do the three things all at the same time. They say China, it is almost unattainable. The three goals can be achieved all at the same time: economic capacity, military strength, and diplomatic influence. They say, well, China's economic clout is getting ever bigger. And its military is getting stronger for its own domestic defense. The suspicions about China would become ever stronger as well. And therefore, others would only form a eco-strategic environment against the growth of China, which is, of course, contradictory to what China has in mind when it comes to its growth patterns. What do you think about this theory? Are the three goals attainable all at the same time?
Well, I think we have to look at the history of Europe and also the U.S., how they come to this point. So I'm actually very confident. We can attain. It just takes time. When you look at the history of Europe, they have war with each other for so many years, but now we can't think of Europe will fight each other, right? And the U.S. also.
Well, they are just in a different way right now with the financial crisis going on.
But that's economics. That's not I'm talking about the military war. Right? So in a sense, I think in a way China will have to follow this historical patterns. We grow our economy, and then we feel more confident, and we feel less urgent to use whatever other forces to solve the issues.
Is China going to be necessarily following the others' footsteps, or China is going to be an exception, Mr. Wang?
China is certainly not going to follow the footsteps of the former imperialist countries. China is now playing a bigger role militarily. For instance, I can take for peaceful purposes. For instance, China sent warships to the Indian Oceans to escort freighters. That's a very good role. That shows increase of China's military clout, but for peace purposes. And of course, with China's strength increasing, we often hear people say China threat. That is only natural, especially the neighboring countries. With a giant standing by your side, you tend to become nervous. But China should prove to our neighboring countries through our action that we follow a diplomatic policy of peace and development, of friendly neighbor policy. I think over time we can succeed in our objective.
Well, certainly that is a big task, but it's very hard to convince others. As we all know, that's probably the hardest job in the world. We're going to continue our discussion, gentlemen, right after this break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching a live edition of Dialogue at the very end of the year 2012. With me in the studio to celebrate this moment and looking forward to the future, we have Mr. Xiao Geng, who is the director of the research with the Fang Global Institute. Welcome, sir. And welcome back to our studio, Wang Xuewen, former vice chief editor of the International Business Daily. Earlier, gentlemen, we've been touching on one important aspect of the New Year speech given by Chinese President Hu Jintao. He specifically talked about China's international role. Now let's move on to some of the other important points. For example, about the economy, which is an area, Dr. Xiao, you are certainly concentrating on for years. China GDP growth rate, that is, of course, a number everybody's looking at. Some say 7.5%, others predict even this year could reach as high as 8%. But what kind of a growth rate, what kind of quality of that growth rate do you think can be healthy for China?
Well, I think for China, now we should not looking for focus on the growth rate. Is really we need to focus on the quality of the growth, and especially we should focus on medium long-term reforms instead of cyclical issues.
Right.
I think the Chinese firms and the Chinese governments, they are already very good at playing the short-term game. In a way, China actually is quite safe. You know, the cyclical, we have passed several cycles, but the problem is that we need to actually deal with the medium, long-term issues.
The medium and long-term issues from your perspective are?
Well, as we can see, it looks all like, you know, for example, the inclusive growth, the inequality, the environmental issues, and also the so-called corruption, land disputes, those issues. Those are really long-term issues, which what I see as the lack of clear property rights, lack of rule of law, you know. So that's the area we have to deal with in order to have a long-term sustainable growth.
Many of the issues, for example, environmental protection issues, corruption issues, land confiscation, all of these are actually quite intertwined with one another, and that is why they are so hard to be resolved. And that, many say, Mr. Wang, not only takes political wisdom, but also a huge political will of this country in order to get these very intertwined issues being solved together. Let's imagine, before I give you this question, the new leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, Mr. Xi Jinping and his colleagues, are putting 100 top priorities on the table. And many of these priorities, though, are very much intertwined with one another. There has to be one thing that can pick up every priorities on the table. If that there is one thing, what do you think that would be?
And that is political reform, because politics belongs to superstructure, and superstructure serves the economic base. With the development of Chinese economy, and the political structure lags behind a little bit. If we don't carry out in the political field, and economic development cannot go on very well. And so, actually, Xi Jinping and his colleagues has already sent a strong message that the new leadership will carry on reform, maybe from political area.
Well,
from corruption.
We've been reading some recent news coming out about Mr. Xi Jinping and his colleagues, and also about Mr. Hu Jintao, who is now still the president of the People's Republic of China. We hear messages of poverty alleviation, messages about urbanization in this country and its necessity for decades to come. We've been hearing about anti-corruption campaigns going on in this country, also about the general spirit that the Chinese Communist Party members should have. For example, how simple a setup of a meeting should be for the Chinese Communist Party members. Not extravagant, but rather as simple as possible to get things done. All of these are different messages coming out over the past few months and weeks. Mr. Xiao, what is your general impression? Looking ahead, when it comes to the quality of growth, how is it going to be balanced with some of the very important but very difficult campaigns going on right now, which are crucial also for this country?
Well, I think the most important issue is really about how to define clearly property rights, how to define rules clearly. Because corruption comes from distorted rules. You know, for example, the property rights to the land is not clear, then you provide opportunities for someone to create corruption. And for example, the protection of depositors. If the rule is not clear, then you get zero interest rate. You know, you screwed up, right? So all those problems, you know, which in a way people want to have political reform, but actually, you look carefully, it is about the property rights. You have to have secure, clear property rights. Then the society will become orderly.
I see. Rule of law, political reform, and probably others have other important words to share with us about what should be done for the year 2013. No matter what, the determination seemed to have been expressed by Mr. Hu Jintao already in his New Year speech, looking forward to the year 2013. I want to thank both of you, gentlemen, for being with us on this very last day of the year 2012. And thank you for watching. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing.
总书记的党中央周围，万众一心，锐意进取，为全面建成小康社会而奋斗。2013年，中国政府和人民将高举中国特色社会主义伟大旗帜，坚持以科学发展为主题，以转变经济发展方式为主线，继续把握好稳中求进的工作总基调，全面推进改革开放和社会主义现代化建设，为实现党的18大确定的目标任务开好局、起好步。
Let's take a look at some of the important highlights of it.
2012年是中国发展进程中具有重大而深远意义的一年。前不久召开的中国共产党第18次全国代表大会和18届一中全会，描绘了全面建成小康社会和深化改革开放的宏伟蓝图，顺利实现了中国共产党中央领导机构新老交替。当前，中国各族人民正紧密团结在以习近平同志为主，我们将坚定不移贯彻一国两制、港人治港、澳人治澳、高度自治方针，深化交流合作，促进香港、澳门长期繁荣稳定。我们将继续推动两岸关系和平发展，造福两岸同胞，维护中华民族根本利益。当前，国际形势继续发生深刻复杂变化，和平、发展、合作、共赢是各国人民的共同愿望。各国相互依存，日益紧密。同时，国际金融危机影响深远，世界经济低速增长态势仍将延续，一些国家和地区动荡不安，世界仍然很不安宁。人类只有一个地球，各国共处一个世界。世界和平与发展需要各国人民同舟共济，共同推进。中国人民始终是促进世界和平与发展的坚定力量。无论国际风云如何变幻，
Hello, and you are watching a live edition of Dialogue coming to you from CCTV News here in Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. 2012 was a significant year for China and many other countries around the world, with a couple of dozen national elections going on. Wrapping up political campaigns and rhetoric, many are pinning their hopes on the year 2013 for getting some important work done. But what are the important priorities for China in the year 2013? What role will China play in the world in the new year? Chinese President Hu Jintao made his New Year's speech on the very last day of 2012.